Minecraft. I've got something different today. We are going to have post-commentary on top of fast-forward footage, and I'll explain why. When I was trying to record during the day today, there was all kinds of noises outside of my apartment that were getting picked up by my microphone, and so that was a bad thing. But when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. One of the things that was a comment on my previous video, I mentioned in passing that I participated in a programming contest this weekend, and a number of people said, Brian, we'd like to hear more about that. So what I've decided to do is I am doing commentary about not the game, but just talking about this programming contest that I participated in, overlaid on top of all of this footage that I had today that had bad audio. And so if you put those things together, basically you could treat this kind of as a podcast if you just want to listen to the sounds of Brian's radio voice. Or if you want to just kind of like watch some of the stuff that was happening in today's episode, you can. Nothing too exciting is going to happen, so if you decide you want to skip this episode altogether, that is fine. But if you're interested in hearing me talk about programming, you can just listen, or you can choose to watch as well. In any case, that's what we have today. I'll try to make it up by having a normal, good, long episode tomorrow. Let's go ahead and get started. A number of people wanted to hear more about the programming contest that I participated in this past weekend, and so I'm just going to babble about it for a while. It was the ICFP Annual Programming Contest. ICFP stands for the International Conference on Functional Programming, and it is an annual conference in computer science that typically happens in the late summer, where there are, important papers in functional programming, Functional programming is one of a few different computer programming paradigms that's been around for a long time and is one of the more important ones, especially in academia these days, and that I'm very interested in, and indeed that some of my research was in back when I was doing my PhD, and so I was published, I think, at least once in ICFP. In any case, it happens in the late summer, and so earlier in the summer, they always hold an annual programming contest. And the overall format of the programming contest is one where the contest takes over a long period of time, typically 72 hours over some weekend. And it's open to everyone in the world, and it gets posted on the internet, and anyone can participate. You can be in teams, and your teams can often be any size. Sometimes they put a maximum size on the teams. And the only restriction is that one person can only be a part of one team, so there's no kind of collaboration across teams. And the problems are often of a nature such that one of two things: either you're given kind of a problem up front and it's like something that you have to solve and write a program to submit, and you end up submitting the program, or it's the case that there'll be some internet web service that you talk to and you send requests back from it and get back responses and use that in order to kind of gain a score over the course of the weekend. And at the end of the contest, with all the submissions and different things or whatever, they eventually figure out who the winner is based on however they're scoring things. And then at the actual conference, wherever it's held that year, that's when they announce the final results. So in any case, the problems are often very interesting. There was one that I participated in a few years ago where it was a Mars rover style problem where you had to program this rover-like thing where you were trying to drive the rover to a particular location across the surface of the planet where it had different craters and different things, and you had sensors on the rover so you could only see so far and detect craters a certain distance in front of you. And your rover had different physics characteristics in terms of how well it could turn and top speeds and different things. And sometimes there would be mazes that you get lost kind of on the surface of, Mars or wherever you're supposed to be driving this robot. And so effectively there were different maps that you would get, and you just have to write an AI that just tries to steer the rover through these maps as fast as possible kind of thing. I wrote a lot of code in that one and did not bad, as I recall, from a few years ago. This year's problem this year basically was a program synthesis kind of problem where basically the goal was they had a server that they'd say, here's a program and you can do a couple of things. You can ask us for some inputs and outputs. The programs are always programs that take as input a number and return another number. So you can think of it, just in, high school algebra classes or whatever, when you have a function like 2x plus 1, if I send in the number 1, I get back the number 3, and if I send in the number 2, I get back the number 5. Although often cases these input-output functions would be much more complicated and arbitrary, and could involve 64-bit numbers, so really, really, really large numbers. And the goal was, with some inputs and outputs, for you to guess the function that the computer was using on the other side, over on their servers. And you could make a guess, but if your guess came back wrong, it would give you a counterexample, like your program computes this number, but actually the answer for this input was this number. And they had like a programming language that had a small set of like a dozen operations that you could put together into arbitrarily large programs. And they include things like if then else, which meant you could have a function, not just like 2x plus 1, but a function that says if the input is 16 million, then output 0, otherwise compute 2x plus 1, which means you could get a whole bunch of inputs and outputs and say, hey, that looks like the function 2x plus 1, and guess that. And then they'd say, oh, nope, you're wrong for the value 16 million. The answer for that one's actually 0, and then you'd have to like either conditionally do that, or maybe their program was for every value greater than or equal to 16 million, then the output's going to be 0. So the point I'm trying to make is the program space and complexity was such that you were really trying to search for a needle in a haystack, or it's more like, imagine they give you the rules that would enable you to construct a planet full of haystacks, and they give you a vague description of a needle, and then they go and ask you to look for it. And each time you come back and say, is this the needle? They say, oh, that one's a little bit too silver. But if you look for one that's grayer, then that's the kind of thing that you're looking for, is maybe a better way to describe the problem. So it was a huge search space kind of problem. And you had to kind of generate all the possible programs that could work with the inputs and outputs that you knew, and then get feedback from them in order to continually refine the program to find the particular needle in the haystack that they were looking for. And there were a lot of possible strategies that you could do. One of the main ones that we did was we constructed programs that enabled us to determine that, hey, guess what? You could write these 4 lines of code, or you could write these 6 lines of code, and it turns out that those 2 bits of code are always equivalent. No matter what inputs you give it, it will give the same outputs. So when trying to generate all the possible programs that could solve, this particular problem that we're trying to solve, you never need to generate the 6-line program, because this 4-line program would always kind of work in its place. And as a result, kind of prune out some of the larger programs that we need to do because they're equivalent to smaller programs. It is almost always the case in the programming contest that you don't necessarily need to use a computer for much of it. And this year's contest was definitely one of those cases. Like, you could just have humans working on the problem and like, here's the inputs and outputs, and like try to intuit it. It never kind of works that way, but you are definitely allowed to have humans in the loop, which is to say, basically, rather than trying to write a computer program that just automates the entire process and sends a bunch of inputs and outputs and tries to do its own logics and heuristics in order to guess, you could also have a bunch of computer tools that humans are using alongside the inputs and outputs you get back from their server, and then have humans kind of steer the progress and say, you know what, I think that it looks like it's a function that looks like this with these kind of special cases, and so let's try to steer our program to work like this. We didn't actually do that this year. In the past, occasionally, that has been a useful thing to do, is basically to have some more human guidance during trying to solve the problem, as opposed to merely having humans write a program that solves the problem, and then the program just goes off on its own and tries to solve problems. That's not a strategy that we happen to use this year. One of the things that I came up with also was there was a way to do kind of like static analysis on these programs and determine, for example, you know what, here's a whole class of programs that will never return an output that's greater than 256, for example. And so that might be useful. If you knew some of the outputs were greater than 256, then you could rule out these programs, but then you could always combine those programs into larger programs that necessarily didn't have that property. We didn't find a good way to kind of like use those heuristics to kind of trim down the search space. This year, I think we ended up having 5 people that participated on our particular team. I've been doing this for a number of years since I moved out here when I was working for Microsoft, and so it's almost always a bunch of programmers and testers and program managers at Microsoft who I've been working with, and this year was no different. There were a few people who, I think the others are all still working at Microsoft, I'm not anymore, that I was working with on this particular problem. And yeah, smart folks. It's fun to go back and work with these folks. I like those guys, and they are smart, which is great. And but at the same time, I haven't been like, I quit my job 9 months ago or whatever it was, and so I haven't really done any programming hardly at all in the past 9 months. I wrote like 100 lines of code for a little JavaScript tool for ultrahardcore on the ultrahardcore subreddit. It's a little tool that you can, it just is a web page that sorts all the upcoming matches so you can see when there's another upcoming match. And that's just about the only code that I've written in the past 9 months. And so I was out of practice for writing code. And so this year, in terms of teams, like, I didn't put my fingers on the keyboard really hardly at all. It's often the case when you are a software developer that you can work with others in terms of either just talking through ideas on the whiteboard or doing pair programming and debugging, where basically one person, is sitting in front of the screen with their hands on the keyboard doing things, and the other person is looking over their shoulder and either helping them kind of like correct mistakes or discussing other possible strategies and algorithms in order to attack a problem, or helping them debug something when you'll see something that they won't. And so that is the role that basically I did over this year's contest. And depending upon how invested you are, like, you can spend, like I said, the contest runs for 72 hours over the weekend. I've done it in the past sometimes where, like, I basically the whole time I'm awake over the weekend, and I cut down on my sleep or whatever, like always trying to work hard at the problem. This year I only spent probably, I don't know, a dozen hours, a little bit more, mostly on Saturday over the weekend. Like, I ended up coming in the afternoon and staying up until like 2:30 in the morning at night in the conference room where we were kind of working together on the problem. And so I wasn't as kind of personally invested in it this year, and part of that was just because I was kind of out of practice in terms of general programming stuff to do it. People ask about programming languages, which is something that I feel passionate about because programming languages were kind of the main area of my PhD research. It's the International Conference on Functional Programming. And so functional programming and functional programming languages are often at the heart of it. And the tiny programming language that they had kind of lambdas and folds. And in general, I have no idea, like, as I'm talking about this, I'm trying to give a somewhat lay overview, but at the same time, I will be using computer science words. And yeah, so apologies if I'm losing people along the way. But basically, it's the case, I think this year and previous years that I've worked with these folks at Microsoft, that for the most part, we have usually used C#, which is Microsoft.NET language. I used to work on the F# programming language, and a bunch of the people that I worked with worked on F# as well, and so we've used some F# as well. F# is kind of a functional programming language that has some object-oriented programming, where C# is more of an object-oriented programming language that has some functional programming. But definitely it is the case nowadays, as well as just my kind of general opinion, that the best languages these days are languages which allow you to combine both functional and object-oriented programming. There are a variety of different programming paradigms: procedural, functional, object-oriented. Object-oriented is kind of like, is something that started becoming the rage in the late 1980s and kind of has been the most popular kind of stuff used in industry ever since, for the most part. And it's a good kind of overall paradigm. The functional paradigm is something that's been around since almost like the birth of computer programming and computer science. I think Lisp came out in 1959 or 1960 or something, and has existed mostly unchanged and is a good example of functional programming. And yeah, it actually, there's a lot of good stuff in it. I guess the main core thing being Lambda and the ability to create various small reusable abstractions that you can then plug into different types of control flow. And in general, it is frustrating to me, as someone who is passionate about programming languages, that so few programming languages, including modern ones, have kind of adopted the useful aspects of functional programming kind of into themselves. As an example of that, Java is a language that's been very popular for a while. I mean, Minecraft is written in it, for goodness sakes. And it's a decent object-oriented language. Not very good on the functional aspects of things. I think Java, even though they're like 7 versions in or something, like still doesn't have Lambda in it, as I recall. I haven't paid much attention to Java over the last few years, and I think eventually they've been working on adding a Lambda to the language. And so it's kind of like missing a few crucial parts that other modern programming languages have. And in general, during my programming language research when I was in school and working on my PhD, it was very frustrating to me how many old ideas were 10, 20, 30, 40, maybe even 50 years old in terms of the history of computer science that were good ideas that had not made it kind of out into the world and into industry. And one of the reasons that I got out of the kind of academic trap and into the industry track, and I came to work at Microsoft, was because the long timelines in the field that I was in, I didn't like the idea of I would work for 20 years on something in programming languages that may or may not ever see the light of day in like real industrial languages that people use in the world. And so I came to Microsoft, and when I was working on F#, that was really good because it was taking some of these ideas that were kind of on the forefront of functional programming and blending it with object-oriented programming, which was the subject of my PhD, and putting it in an industrial strength language that was available to masses of developers as part of Visual Studio. And so that was exciting for me when I was working there. But at the same time, I got kind of like a little bit tired and burnt out on working on it after doing that for a number of years. And so here I am, making Minecraft videos, because those two things go together, right? Let's see. I've babbled. I haven't been paying attention to how long I've been just randomly talking about this. So let me check on the time as well as how much crazy other footage I'd recorded, and I'll talk to you again in a moment. To wind things down here at the end, I'll talk about what was actually happening in today's video. Basically, I knew I was having all the noises outside, and so rather than do what I planned to do, which was some more record farming, or I was thinking also about going back to the Nether and trying to find another nether fortress, instead, I just decided to do some more caving for diamonds, and so I did some exploring the overworld, trying to find caves to go into, and I did get down to the diamond level and one kind of like decent section of cave at one point, but I didn't find any diamonds, and it ended up opening up into a big cave. And it's really interesting. When I'm not talking to you guys or talking to myself, I tend to get a bit more tentative and scared of the mobs. And so, yeah, rather than risk taking a whole lot of damage, I ended up kind of exiting that cave system. I then went looking for another cave system and like found an ocean that was kind of like nearby, kind of like just to the south of where I lived, and ended up sailing across of it because I had kind of a hunch of somewhere where I could go. I ended up going underground again one night to just kind of like dig my way down. I got into a mine shaft, but it was also pretty scary in there, and I was hearing cave spiders, and so I exited out of there. But then eventually I saw a desert, and I was like, that looks interesting or familiar, and sure enough, it is the place where we found the horses, and so I rediscovered where the horses are. Unfortunately, the easiest route from where I live to where the horses are involves taking a boat across an ocean, and so it's still kind of a pain in the neck to kind of go and revisit the horses, but at least I know where they are. And then I was thinking about trying to go back, and I picked up like a saddle and some horse armor, and then was going to go back the next day, and then it turned out that it was raining when I tried to go upstairs, and I didn't want to like go out in the rain and possibly a thunderstorm kind of during the middle of the day on a long journey back to go get the horses, and so I ended up quitting doing that. I have no idea as I'm talking about this if all of these things will have already happened on the video, although I'm hoping that I'm timing this commentary well enough that what I'm talking about will be right near the end of the video right now. So in any case, if you wanted a quick summary of kind of what happened in the video, at the end of the day, I didn't find any diamonds. And I think I'm starting to discover that I'm not good at finding diamonds in this game, because I notice in ultra-hardcore matches, especially of late, I've had trouble finding diamonds. I'm not sure if I'm too tentative or I spend too much time at higher levels of cave rather than going down to the lava layer and the diamond layer and kind of like doing all my exploring around there. But I'm really struggling to get diamonds, and so I'm not sure what I'm going to do about that, because we kind of desperately need them to move forward in this Let's Play. If you have comments or suggestions, you can let me know, but I don't do any branch mining, and so that's the easiest way to get them, but I am preventing myself from doing that. In any case, I'm completely rambling at this point. I hope that you guys are having a great day. I hope this episode turned out somewhat workable for the people who chose to watch it, and hopefully tomorrow we'll be back to kind of more normal stuff in terms of Minecraft exploration and tactics. See you guys later. Bye-bye.